The gunship came in low and wrong over Halden Air Base at 2 in the morning, one main landing gear torn away by ground fire over the objective, and its long fuselage riding nose-heavy on a single wheel until the belly finally caught the runway at the wrong angle. The spine of the aircraft folding under its own weight in a shriek of tearing aluminum that threw sparks 50 feet into the dark and lit a spreading pool of jet fuel beneath the wreck. Within 4 seconds of the first impact, 5 crew still strapped into their positions, inside a fuselage now burning at both ends at once, while pressurized rounds from the mission pallet in the cargo bay began cooking off in the heat like gunfire. Nobody was actually firing. Senior Airman Nell Cavanagh, the crash rescue firefighter everyone on the flight line joked only ever drove her truck as far as the wash rack, and never anywhere that mattered, was already rolling toward the fire before the crash horn finished its first cycle, her hands finding the wheel of Crash 6 by memory in the dark, while over the radio, Master Sergeant Roland Espy's voice cut through the chaos with 4 words that would decide, for every other truck on that line, whether anyone went in at all. Hold. That thing is unsurvivable. It had started as a routine extraction gone sideways 40 minutes earlier. The gunship, call sign Werewolf 4-1, a hard-flown veteran of the squadron everyone simply called the Werewolves, taking a burst of ground fire on its final gun run that had shredded a hydraulic line and torn the right main gear half off its mount, the crew nursing a crippled aircraft home on a wing, and a prayer only to lose the fight in the last 400 feet, the gear finally giving way completely on touchdown and letting the fuselage slam belly-first into the runway with enough force to snap its own back just aft of the wing box. The forward compartment, where the pilot and co-pilot sat, had come to rest tilted hard to one side with the cockpit's escape hatch jammed against buckled skin. The aft section, where the rest of the crew rode, had folded almost in half, trapping 2 of them behind wreckage that had never been designed to bend that way, and was now doing it anyway, glowing orange at the seams. Halden itself was a long, low base, built around a single runway that served both a conventional airlift wing and the smaller special operations flying group the Werewolves belonged to, which meant Nell's flight covered 2 very different kinds of aircraft on any given week. Cargo planes that rarely did anything more dramatic than blow a tire on landing, and gunships that came home, when they came home, hurt at all. Hurt in ways a training manual could only approximate. The fire station sat almost exactly equidistant between the 2 flight lines for exactly that reason, close enough to either runway that a truck could be rolling within seconds of any crash horn, and it was that same geography that put Crash 6 at the standoff line within 90 seconds of Werewolf 4-1's first radio call, in time to watch the whole disaster happen rather than simply arrive to its aftermath. Master Sergeant Espy had run enough of these scenarios in enough exercises to know the shape of a fire before he ever laid eyes on it, and what he saw through his windshield as his own truck skidded to a stop at the mandated 300-foot standoff line told him everything the manual would have told him too. Full involvement fuel fire feeding off ruptured tanks on both sides of the fuselage, ordnance from the mission pallet already popping in the heat at roughly 9-second intervals and climbing in frequency as the temperature climbed with it, and 5 human beings sealed inside a structure that was actively cooking from the outside in. He keyed his radio and gave the order that 30 years of training told him was the only responsible one a fire chief could give. All trucks hold at the line, foam on the perimeter only, nobody goes past 300 feet until that ordnance stops cooking off, because a dead firefighter helps exactly 0 of the 5 people still inside that aircraft. Espy had built that 300-foot number the hard way, years before Halden, out of a training command's own accident history. A list, updated every few years and briefed to every new crash rescue crew, of firefighters who had gone forward of a marked standoff line against a fire somebody had correctly assessed as too far gone, and hadn't come back to explain why they'd tried. He knew the list well enough to recite 4 names from it without looking anything up, and he thought about all 4 of them in the 2 seconds it took him to key his radio. because the entire purpose of the number he was quoting was to keep a fifth truck crew from becoming a fifth name on it. It was not caution for caution's sake. It was the specific, hard-earned caution of a man who had buried the alternative more than once and had promised himself, a long time ago, that he would never again let hope talk. A crew passed a line the evidence didn't support. The other trucks obeyed instantly, arcing their foam streams into the outer edge of the blaze from a safe distance the way training demanded. Every hose crew on that flight line watching a fire. None of them could get close enough to actually fight, listening to the flat, rhythmic pop of cooking ammunition, counting off seconds like a clock nobody wanted to hear. Airman First Class, Freddie Nakamura, the youngest man on the gunship's crew, and the loadmaster riding the aft ramp that night, had been thrown clear of his harness in the initial impact and lay half-conscious against a jammed cargo door, close enough to a gap in the torn fuselage skin that the cooler night air reaching his face was the only reason he hadn't already stopped breathing the smoke pouring past him. Captain Dov Amberley, the aircraft commander, sat pinned upright in his seat by a collapsed instrument panel, with a headset still clipped over one ear, conscious enough to hear his own crew's ragged breathing over the intercom, and not conscious enough to do anything about any of it. Over the tower frequency, a controller who had never had to talk a burning aircraft through anything worse than a fuel spill kept reading the same clipped update to anyone who'd listen. Werewolf 4-1 down and burning, runway 27 closed, 5 souls reported aboard, crash crews on scene and holding. The words "souls reported aboard" landing harder in the tower cab each time he said them than they had the time before, because everyone listening already understood that reported and confirmed alive were not, at that particular minute, the same thing. Behind the standoff line, the base's second alarm units were still 90 seconds from arriving with additional foam and manpower, their headlights just visible cresting the rise past the fuel farm, close enough to matter for the fire's outer edge, and nowhere near close enough to matter for the 5 people still trapped inside it. Airman D. Quill, working the foam nozzle on the truck parked nearest Nell's, kept glancing sideways at Crash 6 between bursts, not because he expected anything from it, but because some part of him had learned, in 3 months of working next to her, to watch what Nell Cavanagh did with her hands whenever things got bad, and her hands, in that moment, were not doing what a firefighter's hands do when they've accepted a hold order. Nell brought Crash 6 to a stop nose-in at the standoff line behind 2 other trucks, already arcing foam at the fire's outer edge, killed the engine's idle surge with a habit built from 100 drills, and sat for exactly 1 second with both hands on the wheel doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with the manual Espy had just quoted over the radio, and everything to do with a clock she had learned to read a long time ago in a different life nobody on this flight line knew anything about. 5 crew, a fuel fire climbing past the temperature where aluminum starts losing its strength, ordnance cooking off at 9 seconds and closing, and a fire chief, a good one, a careful one, giving the only order the manual would ever let him give. The order that was correct for every fire he'd ever fought and wrong, she already knew in her gut, for the specific handful of minutes this one was going to give them, before there was nothing left inside that fuselage worth reaching. Her own proximity suit sat folded behind Crash 6's bench seat, exactly where she left it after every shift, aluminized shoulders bright even in the dark, and she was already reaching for it before her boots hit the tarmac. Nell Cavanagh had been assigned to Halden's Fire Emergency Services flight for 14 months by the time the gunship went down, and in those 14 months, she had built herself a reputation that had, without her ever quite meaning it to, calcified into a joke the whole squadron repeated without thinking twice about where it came from. She showed up early for every shift, inventoried her SCBA bottle and proximity suit with a thoroughness that bordered on ritual, kept Crash 6's foam lines flushed, and her turnout gear folded with a precision nobody else on the flight bothered with, and almost never got called to anything bigger than a fuel spill, a hot brake job on a taxiing cargo plane, or the twice-daily chore of running the trucks through the wash rack after a dusty exercise. The nickname itself had a specific afternoon behind it, one Nell remembered better than most people would have guessed. A visiting safety inspector had walked the flight line 4 months into her assignment and stopped at Crash 6 longer than he'd stopped anywhere else, watching her spend the better part of 40 minutes hosing dried mud off the truck's undercarriage, with a care he clearly hadn't expected from a routine washdown, checking wheel wells and axle seals most crews would have rinsed and forgotten in 10. He'd asked her, not unkindly, whether she treated every wash like an inspection, and she'd told him honestly that a truck you hadn't checked carefully was a truck you couldn't trust, the one time it actually mattered, and he'd laughed and repeated the line to Espy as a compliment. By the time it had made its second and third lap around the squadron, though, the compliment had worn down into something smaller and easier to say. Cavanagh only drives the truck as far as the wash rack, and nobody, including the inspector, had ever meant to leave it there. But that was where it had landed anyway. Master Sergeant Espy had said some version of it to her more than once, in the easy, unbothered way of a man who had decided something about a person early and never seen a reason to reconsider it. He'd meant nothing cruel by it. He genuinely believed, the way a good chief believes things he's tested against 14 months of quiet, uneventful shifts, that Cavanagh was a competent by-the-book firefighter who happened to have landed on a flight with very little real fire to fight, and that her careful, unremarkable diligence was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd simply never been handed a real one. He had no way of knowing that the same quiet, unremarkable diligence he was watching her apply to a wash rack and a foam nozzle was the exact discipline that had once kept her alive inside burning structures most of his squadron had never heard existed, because none of that had ever made it onto a piece of paper anyone at Halden was cleared to read. What nobody on that flight line knew, because it had been left off every record that followed her from her last assignment, was that Nell Cavanagh had spent 3 years before Halden inside a small, specialized crash rescue element that supported forward special operations aviation units. The kind of unit built to go into wrecks and hot extraction scenarios that a conventional base fire department would never be sent into in the first place, working under a call sign that had followed her quietly through a string of hard nights, and then, the way a call sign does when a person finally walks away, followed nobody at all once she left. She had gone by Forge in that world, a name nobody at Halden had ever once heard spoken, and she had earned it the unglamorous way, not through a single dramatic rescue, but through years of exactly the kind of methodical, unshowy competence that everyone at Halden mistook for someone who'd simply never been tested. The training that had built that competence had been almost entirely unglamorous, in exactly the way real crash rescue work usually is. Endless hours drilling proximity suit entries into mock fuselages rigged with controlled fires, learning to read a burning airframe's structural behavior the way a sailor reads weather, memorizing how long an aluminized suit could actually be trusted against radiant heat before its rated protection ran out, and learning, above almost everything else, that the manual's clean categories of survivable and unsurvivable existed to protect the average firefighter on an average night and were never meant to be treated as a law of physics. She had gone into structures other crews had already written off more times than she ever discussed with anyone, and she had learned the hard way, on more than one of those nights, exactly how much could still be done inside a window most people assumed had already closed. The unit she had come from measured its people less by rank than by a quieter, more particular kind of trust. Whether you could be handed a hopeless-looking structure and a stopwatch and be relied upon to bring back everyone who was still reachable, and to know, without anyone telling you, exactly when reachable had finally run out. The one night that trust had failed her had come at the end of her 3rd year. At a forward hangar, she still, 3 years later, never named out loud even to herself, when a fuel cart fire had spread into a maintenance bay faster than any prior drill had ever modeled it, and she had gone in for a crew chief who had been trapped behind a jammed roll-up door with the same calm certainty she had carried into every hard structure before that one. She had gotten close enough to hear him, close enough to answer him, and not close enough in the end to reach him before the bay's structure gave way, in a way her training had never quite prepared her to survive standing that near to. Nobody had blamed her afterward. Not her commander, not the investigation board, not a single person who reviewed the timeline and the temperatures and the numbers. But blame from other people had never been the problem. The problem was the quiet, private certainty she had carried out of that hangar, and never fully set down since, that somewhere in those numbers there had been a half-second she should have found and hadn't, and no official finding of no fault had ever quite managed to argue her out of believing it. There were nights, in those 14 quiet months, when Nell missed the old work more than she wanted to admit, not the danger of it, and not the losses, but the specific, singular clarity of standing between a bad outcome and a worse one, with her hands already knowing exactly what to do about it. Washing trucks didn't ask that of her. Logging bottle pressures didn't ask that of her. She had told herself more than once that quiet was the whole point, that she had bought the right to be unremarkable for a while, and simply hadn't found a way to explain that to anyone who might have asked, if anyone had ever actually asked. Nobody had. That was its own kind of mercy, and its own kind of loneliness, and she had learned to live inside both at once. Airman Deke Quill, the newest firefighter on her crew, was the only person in 14 months who had ever looked twice at the way Nell handled her gear. The unhurried economy of her hands checking a regulator seal. The way she could read a fire's behavior off nothing more than smoke color and wind, while everyone else was still watching the flames themselves. The calm she carried into every drill that made the instructors sweat harder than she ever seemed to. He'd asked her once, quietly, over coffee at the end of a night shift, where she'd learned to move like that, and she'd given him a half answer about a previous assignment, and let the conversation drift somewhere easier, and he'd let it go, the way people at Halden let a lot of things go, because everyone on a flight line was carrying something they didn't talk about. What Quill had come to believe privately, without ever saying it out loud to anyone else on the crew, was that Nell Cavanagh was quietly the most capable firefighter he had ever worked beside, and that the flight was wasting something rare every single shift it left her running foam checks and wash rack rotations, instead of anything that actually tested her. He never mentioned any of this to Espy directly, partly out of loyalty to a chief he respected, and partly because he suspected correctly that Espy would have needed to see it for himself before he ever would have believed it. She had put in for a transfer not long after that hangar, told almost nobody the details of where she'd been or why she'd left, and found something close to peace in the unglamorous rhythm of a conventional base fire department, where the worst a bad day usually offered was a fuel spill or a hot brake job, not a structure she couldn't save no matter how well she'd been trained to try. She hadn't planned to hide what she used to be. She had simply discovered that nobody at Halden ever asked, and that not being asked was its own kind of quiet she had badly needed for a while. She was standing at Crash 6's cab that night, running the pre-shift check she ran every night whether or not anyone ever noticed her running it, when the first radio call about Werewolf 41's rough approach crackled across the flight line's monitor, and something in her chest tightened the way it hadn't in 14 quiet months. Not fear, exactly, but the old familiar recognition of a clock she could already hear running, whether anyone else could hear it yet or not. By the time the gunship's spine finally gave way on the runway and the first fuel fire lit the night sky orange, Espy had already run the calculation that 30 years of training had built into him as pure reflex. And every piece of it told him the same hard, correct thing. Full involvement fire, ordnance cooking off and accelerating, 5 souls trapped inside a structure actively losing its own integrity, and a standoff distance that existed precisely because firefighters who ignored it had a well-documented habit of becoming a 6th casualty instead of a rescue. He had given the order to hold at 300 feet the instant his truck stopped moving, and he would have given the exact same order again if asked, because the manual he'd trained his entire flight on didn't have a clause for "it works out differently this one time." The mutual aid dispatcher back at the fire station relayed the numbers SB already knew by heart the moment he asked for them. The base's second alarm response was 6 minutes out. Structural collapse risk on the aft fuselage was already climbing past the point any manual called acceptable, and the cooking off interval on the mission pallet had tightened from 9 seconds to just over 6 in the 2 minutes since touchdown, which meant whatever window existed for anyone to survive, inside that wreck was measured now in single minutes, rather than the 6 it would take reinforcements to arrive. SB relayed all of it back to command with the flat, professional calm of a man reciting a fact he wished were different, and command's answer came back exactly the way doctrine required it to. Hold the line, protect the survivable perimeter, do not risk additional personnel against an unsurvivable structure fire. Nell stood beside Crash 6 at the standoff line and watched the fire the way she had once been trained to watch fires that most people were trained to run from, reading the smoke's color and the flame's rhythm instead of just its size. And what she saw told her something the manual's clean categories didn't have room for. That a fire calling itself unsurvivable and a fire that was actually unsurvivable were not always the same fire, and that the difference, when it existed at all, usually lived inside a window measured in seconds rather than minutes. The smoke rolling off the aft compartment was still running gray rather than the flat black that told an experienced eye a structure had already gone past saving, and the flame pattern along the forward fuselage was still licking rather than fully rolling, 2 small, specific signs that meant almost nothing to anyone reading the fire from 300 feet away, and everything to someone who had spent 3 years learning to read them from 6 feet closer than anyone else was willing to stand. The wind, too, was working slightly in her favor, carrying the worst of the radiant heat off toward the empty taxiway rather than back across the standoff line. A detail she registered without quite deciding to, the way a person notices weather that might matter later, without yet knowing exactly how. She ran her own arithmetic standing there, the specific kind she had once run for a living and hadn't run in earnest in 3 years. 5 crew, an aft compartment folding but not yet fully collapsed, a proximity suit rated to reflect the majority of a fire's radiant heat for a limited window measured in minutes rather than hours, and an SCBA bottle carrying roughly 15 minutes of air under calm breathing and considerably less under the kind of exertion this fire was about to demand of her. 15 minutes of air was not the number that mattered, though. The number that mattered was the 6-second cooking-off interval, and how fast it was going to keep tightening, because a structure whose ordnance was accelerating that quickly toward continuous detonation was not going to give her 15 minutes, or even 5. It was going to give her, if she was very fast and very lucky, something closer to 90 seconds, and she intended to spend every one of them. For one unguarded moment, standing at the edge of that line, the hangar she still didn't name out loud rose up in her memory anyway, uninvited, the way it always did whenever a fire in front of her looked close enough to the one she hadn't won. The same gray smoke, the same licking flame, the same 15-minute bottle that had somehow still run out too soon 3 years earlier. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to blink, and then she did the one thing she had never quite managed to do in 3 years of remembering that hangar. She let the memory serve as a warning instead of a verdict, a reminder of exactly which mistakes to avoid this time, rather than proof that she shouldn't try again at all. The 2 fires were not the same fire. She made herself believe that on purpose, the way you make yourself believe anything true that fear would rather you doubted. She stepped forward to the edge of the standoff line, close enough that Espy turned from his own radio to look at her, and told him, in a voice pitched low enough that only the nearest crews could hear it, that she could get 5 people out of that wreck if she went now, before the interval tightened any further, and that every minute they spent following the correct procedure for an ordinary fire was a minute. This specific fire was going to spend proving it wasn't one. Espy told her, flatly and without unkindness, that the manual existed precisely because good firefighters sometimes believed things like that and were wrong. That 30 years of standing at lines like this one had taught him exactly how that particular kind of confidence usually ended, and that he was not going to lose a 6th person tonight, chasing a feeling. "I've buried people who were sure, Cavanagh," he told her not unkindly, "and I am not doing it again on my line." She didn't argue with him the way most people would have. By raising her voice or listing a resume nobody at Halden would have believed anyway. She told him instead, quietly, that she understood exactly why the manual said what it said and that she was going anyway, because 5 people were dying on a clock the manual hadn't been written fast enough to keep up with, and because somewhere she had learned, the hard way, that the correct order and the right thing to do were not always standing in the same place at the same time. She was already pulling her proximity suit's hood into place before he could answer her, already keying her SCBA's regulator open with hands that had done this exact sequence more times than anyone at Halden would ever know, and she crossed the standoff line at a dead run, while Espy's voice, sharp now with something closer to alarm than authority, told her to get back, told her that thing was unsurvivable, told her nobody was ordering her forward. She heard him. She kept moving anyway. Behind her, Quill took one involuntary step past the line himself before Espy's arm shot out and stopped him, because whatever was happening in front of them, the chief still had 4 other trucks and their crews to keep alive, and he was not going to compound one act of insubordination with a second. In the 11 seconds it took her to close the distance from the standoff line to the gunship's torn hull, Nell had already built the shape of the next 90 seconds in her head, the way she used to build it in a different life. 5 crew, 5 separate trips, an order of extraction that put the most reachable survivor first and the most trapped one last. A mental map of hatches and jammed doors. She was reading off the wreck's silhouette before she'd even reached it, because the fire didn't care what the manual called it, and neither in the end did she. She went in through the aft cargo door first, the one hanging half off its frame where the fuselage had folded, and found Airman Nakamura exactly where the wreck's angle told her he'd be thrown. Slumped against a jammed panel 8 feet inside, conscious enough to raise one hand toward her voice, but not conscious enough to move under his own power, choking on smoke thick enough that her helmet lamp barely cut 6 feet into it. She had him up and moving in under 4 seconds, one arm locked under his chest in a carry she hadn't used in 3 years and hadn't forgotten in any of them, and she was back through the torn door and clear of the wreck with him at 18 seconds on a clock. Nobody but her was actually counting, laying him down hard on the tarmac in the cooler air beyond the fire's edge before turning, without a single wasted motion, straight back toward the hull. At the standoff line, 300 feet away, every hose crew still holding position watched her clear the wreck once, alive, carrying someone else who was also alive, and for 1 full second, nobody on that line, not Espy, not Quill, not the tower controller listening on his handheld, made a single sound. The second trip took her forward along the buckled spine to the folded aft compartment where 2 more of the crew had been riding, and the 6-second cooking-off interval Espy had relayed over the radio announced itself twice, while she was still working the jammed access panel loose with a pry bar she'd grabbed off Crash 6's rack without breaking stride. Each flat concussive pop from the mission pallet, somewhere behind the flames close enough that she felt it in her chest before she heard it in her ears. She found Technical Sergeant Rourke, the flight engineer, pinned by a fallen equipment rack with just enough give in the wreckage for her to lever him free, and she had him out and clear at 39 seconds, laid down 12 feet from Nakamura, already breathing on his own in ragged, smoke-torn gasps that told her his airway, at least, was going to hold. Espy keyed his radio without quite meaning to, and said nothing into it, because there was nothing in 30 years of standard procedure that told him what to report when the unsurvivable structure in front of him had just produced its second live extraction in under 40 seconds. She went back in a third time through the same torn seam, deeper now, because Staff Sergeant Marisol Vieira, the sensor operator, had been thrown clear of her station into a gap between two collapsed equipment racks, where the smoke sat thickest, and the heat radiating off the buckled skin around her was already climbing past what Nell's suit was rated to shrug off for more than a handful of seconds longer. She found Vieira disoriented, coughing, trying and failing to crawl toward a doorway that had folded shut behind her, and Nell got an arm around her ribs and half-carried, half-dragged her back out through smoke so thick that for 4 full seconds neither of them could see anything at all, clearing the hull at 58 seconds with the ordnance behind them, popping now at intervals so tight they had stopped sounding like individual explosions and started sounding like a single continuous roar. Vieira, laid down beside the other two, grabbed blindly for Nell's scorched glove for just a moment before Nell pulled free and turned back a third time, and that single wordless grip was the only thank you either of them had time for. Behind the line, Quill had stopped working his own hose entirely, foam stream drifting off target while he stared, and it took Espy's flat, sharp order to get his attention back on the fire's outer edge instead of the silhouette moving through its center. The fourth trip was the one that came closest to costing her everything, because First Lieutenant Tarn Winthrop, the co-pilot, was still strapped into a seat that had jammed at an angle no standard harness release was built to handle, conscious enough to be afraid and not strong enough, with one arm pinned, to help free herself. Nell burned 4 full seconds she didn't have cutting the harness webbing, with a blade she'd carried on her belt through 3 years of a different life, felt the proximity suit's outer layer begin to blister against heat that had climbed well past anything a training exercise had ever thrown at her, and pulled Winthrop free at 71 seconds, with the fire's roar behind them, loud enough now that she was reading Winthrop's lips, more than hearing her voice asking if they were going to make it. Nell didn't answer with words. She simply kept moving, because there was still one more person inside that wreck, and the clock in her head had never once stopped running. Behind her, the section of aft fuselage she had already passed through twice groaned audibly, a long, low sound of metal finally admitting what the fire had been doing to it for the last minute, and every firefighter still standing at 300 feet heard it and understood, without anyone saying so, exactly how little time was left. By the fourth trip, the entire standoff line had gone almost completely silent, except for the hiss of foam and the distant, tightening rhythm of the cook-off. Every crew member from every truck watching a single silhouette move in and out of a fire that had been declared, on the record, unsurvivable 4 separate times in under a minute and 20 seconds. Nobody was counting seconds out loud, but everybody standing at that line was counting them privately, the way people count anything they are too afraid to look away from, and every time that silhouette reappeared carrying someone new, the counting started over from 0 with a little more disbelief attached to it than the time before. Nakamura, still lying where Nell had first set him down, had recovered enough by then to prop himself up on one elbow and watch her go back in a 5th time, and he would say afterward that it was the only moment of the whole night he remembered with total clarity, because some part of him understood, even half-conscious, that he was watching something he was never going to see again. The 5th trip took her back into the forward compartment for Captain Amberley, pinned upright by the collapsed instrument panel, with a headset still clipped over one ear, and just enough awareness left to grip weakly at her arm when she reached him. And it was the hardest extraction of the 5, because the panel itself had to be forced back, with a combination of leverage and raw strength that left her SCBA gauge reading dangerously close to empty by the time she finally got him loose. She cleared the hull with Amberley at 89 seconds, 1 second before the 90th, laying him down beside the other 4 just as a section of the aft fuselage, the section she had crawled through twice already, finally gave way completely behind her in a collapse loud enough that every firefighter still standing at the 300-foot line felt it in the ground under their boots. 5 crew lay on the tarmac in the cool night air, sooted and coughing and utterly, improbably alive, and Nell Cavanagh stood over them, pulling her scorched hood back with hands that had finally, only now, started to shake. Master Sergeant Espy reached her less than a minute later, having crossed the standoff line himself the instant he saw the 5th trip clear the wreck, and he stood over the 5 crew members Nell had just carried out one at a time, saying nothing at all for a long moment, because there was nothing in 30 years of training that had prepared him for watching someone do calmly and methodically the exact thing every manual he'd ever read insisted couldn't be done. He had called that fire unsurvivable, and he had been right about the fire. Full involvement, ordnance cooking off, structural collapse well underway, and wrong, completely and specifically wrong, about the one variable the manual had never accounted for standing at his own line that night. He knelt beside her for a moment as the second alarm trucks finally rolled up behind them, and asked her quietly, the only question he had left in him, how, and she told him only that she'd done it before, which was true, and left out everything else, which was also, for the moment, true to the only life she'd been allowed to talk about in 14 months. Word of what had actually happened at that wreck reached Major Lorne Pike within the hour, first as a stunned, half-disbelieving report from the flight line, and then, once he started asking the obvious follow-up questions about how a base firefighter with 14 quiet months on record had just soloed a 5-person extraction out of a fire the entire crash crew had assessed as unsurvivable, as a records request that came back flagged in a way Pike had only seen a handful of times in his career. Nell Cavanagh's personnel file, the ordinary one everyone at Holden had access to, showed 14 months of unremarkable, competent service, and nothing before that a routine records check could actually open, because the 3 years preceding it sat behind a classification marking that outranked the entire base. Pike spent most of that first morning on the phone with people whose offices he'd never had reason to call before, working his way up a chain of approvals that grew shorter and more careful with every call, until he finally reached someone willing to tell him, in the deliberate language people use when they are choosing every word on purpose, that the record existed, that it was real, and that exactly one line of it could ever leave that office. It took one phone call through channels Pike had to be read into specially to get an answer, and the answer that finally came back down used careful, deliberate language that told him everything it was allowed to, and nothing more. That the individual in question had spent 3 years attached to a specialized crash rescue element supporting forward special operations aviation, that her service in that assignment had been extensive, exemplary, and closed out honorably, and that exactly one unclassified line existed in the entire sealed record, cleared for release, specifically because Holden's leadership had a legitimate need to understand who they actually had assigned to their flight line. Pike read that single line to himself twice before he ever said it out loud to anyone else, and then he called the squadron into formation the next morning to say it where everyone could hear it. He told them, standing in front of a flight line still smelling faintly of scorched aluminum, that Senior Airman Cavanagh's record contained exactly one sentence he was permitted to share, and that it was this: credited with the sustained voluntary recovery of personnel from structural fires under conditions her unit's own doctrine classified as non-survivable on multiple documented occasions over a 3-year period of exemplary and selfless service. He let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before he added the part that wasn't in any record at all, that whatever this woman had walked away from before Holden, she had walked into a burning gunship the night before without a single order telling her to, and carried out 5 people alive who every trained professional on that flight line, himself included in spirit if not in person, had genuinely believed were already lost. Captain Amberley, still faintly hoarse and standing in that formation on borrowed strength more than full recovery, asked Pike afterward, quietly, whether the woman who had pulled him out of a collapsing gunship was the same one he'd shaken hands with twice on the flight line, without ever once learning her name. And Pike told him, honestly, that she was, and that he suspected most of the squadron was going to spend a long time adjusting to that particular fact. Lieutenant Winthrop, still favoring the arm that had been pinned, told anyone who'd listen in the days that followed that she remembered almost nothing about the extraction itself except the specific steadying certainty in the grip that had cut her free. A detail she found herself returning to more than the fire itself whenever she tried to describe that night to anyone. Sergeant Rourke, for his part, kept telling the same small joke to anyone who'd stand still long enough to hear it, that he'd spent months nodding at Cavanagh in the chow line without once wondering what she actually did for a living, and that he intended to start asking better questions about everyone he thought he already understood. Espy stood in that formation and said nothing for a long moment after Pike finished speaking, because he was doing the same arithmetic he'd done at the standoff line the night before, except this time the numbers were pointing somewhere he hadn't expected them to go. He had called that fire unsurvivable, because everything he knew told him it was, and he had been overruled not by an order from above but by a quiet, unremarkable woman who had apparently spent 3 years proving, under a classification he'd never be cleared to read in full, that some fires only looked unsurvivable to people who hadn't yet learned what she had learned. He walked out of formation, crossed the tarmac to where Nell stood at the edge of the crowd, trying, as she always did, to make herself smaller than the moment wanted her to be. And he took off his own helmet and held it out to her without a word, because some things he'd decided somewhere in the last 12 hours didn't need a speech attached to them to mean what they meant. Nell didn't take the helmet right away. She looked at it, and then at him, and understood. The way she'd understood 100 small gestures in a different life that had never needed spelling out either. That Espy wasn't handing her a piece of equipment, so much as handing her back something he'd taken from her, without meaning to. The first time he'd repeated that joke about the wash rack, an acknowledgement that the joke had never been true, and that he, of all people, should have looked harder before he'd decided it was. She took the helmet then, quietly, and told him it was all right, because it mostly was, and because she had never actually needed his permission to be capable of what she'd already known she could do. Captain Amberley found her 3 days later, still faintly hoarse from the smoke but steady on his feet, and didn't have much of a speech ready either. Just a quiet, sincere accounting of the fact that he and 4 other people were alive, specifically because she had decided, alone, at a standoff line everyone else had correctly obeyed, that the math in her head mattered more than the math in the manual that night. Freddie Nakamura, the youngest of the 5, and still the one most visibly rattled by how close the whole night had come to going differently, told her afterward that he'd felt her arm lock under his chest before he'd even fully understood what was happening, and that it was the specific, steadying certainty in that grip, not fear, not hesitation, just competence, that had told him, in the middle of the worst 30 seconds of his life, that he was actually going to make it out. He asked her, a little sheepishly, whether she'd teach him some of what she knew, and she told him she would, because that, too, had been part of the old job. Not just doing the work, but making sure somebody else could do it after her. Nobody at Halden called her the washrack firefighter anymore, not the way they used to, though she noticed, and quietly appreciated, that nobody made a production out of the change either. The joke simply stopped. The way jokes do once everyone in on them finally understands what they'd actually been laughing at. And in its place came something quieter, and, to Nell, considerably more useful. A flight line that had finally stopped watching her out of the corner of its eye and started simply working alongside her the way any competent crew works alongside someone they trust without needing to be told to. She still kept her old caution close, the private conviction that the hangar fire she hadn't won 3 years earlier had earned its place in her memory honestly. But she found, in the weeks that followed, that the weight of it had shifted somehow, from a verdict she carried alone to a lesson she had apparently, without ever meaning to, spent 3 years teaching herself how to answer. Major Pike offered her quietly, and without any pressure attached to it, a path back to the kind of specialized crash rescue work her sealed record said she'd once done, and Nell surprised herself by turning it down without needing more than a night to think it over, telling him only that Halden's flight line, the ordinary fuel spills, the hot brake jobs, the wash rack every morning, had become, somewhere in 14 quiet months, the place she actually wanted to be, and that she'd rather finish building something steady here than go looking for the next hangar that might not let her win either. Pike didn't argue with her. He simply told her that her file would note the offer and her answer, and that either one would have been the right one, which was, in its own understated way, exactly the kind of respect she'd spent 3 years learning to live without expecting. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the hangars, Nell was back at the wash rack running water over Crash 6's undercarriage, exactly the way she had every morning for 14 months, because the truck still needed washing whether or not the previous night had changed anything about who people thought she was. What was different this time was that she wasn't alone doing it. Deke Quill showed up first with a second hose without being asked. Then Rourke and Vieira, still moving carefully from smoke they hadn't fully cleared out of their lungs. Then Nakamura carrying 2 coffees he clearly hadn't been sent to buy. And finally, Espy himself, sleeves rolled, taking the second nozzle from Quill's hands like it was the most natural thing in the world for a fire chief to be doing at 6 in the morning. Nobody said very much while they worked. Nobody needed to. 5 people who owed her their lives, and 1 man who had, for one long and ultimately survivable night, been wrong about exactly what kind of firefighter he had standing at the edge of his line. Simply washed a fire truck together in the gray early light, the way any crew washes a truck when the truck and the people who ride it have both earned a quiet morning. Nell Cavanagh, Forge, to a handful of people scattered across a career she rarely spoke of, and simply Cavanagh to everyone at Halden who mattered now. Ran the hose over the last stubborn patch of soot on the rear bumper, and let herself believe, for the first time in 3 long years, that the fire she hadn't been able to win was finally starting to loosen its grip on the ones she had. If a story like this one is worth your time, hit like and subscribe, because it genuinely helps a channel like this one keep finding the ones everyone underestimated and telling their stories the way they deserve. And down in the comments, tell me honestly, if you were standing at that standoff line watching a fire chief with 30 years of good reasons call it unsurvivable, would you have held the line like you were trained to, or done what Nell Cavanagh did and trusted the 90 seconds nobody else believed you had?